Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The dim light of the late afternoon sun filtered through the small window, casting long shadows that danced across the dusty attic floor. The sweet smell of aged wood and forgotten memories filled the air as I carefully maneuvered around stacks of old boxes, my footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust. As I reached for a weathered trunk in the corner, a peculiar sensation prickled the back of my neck. For a moment, it seemed as if a soft, rhythmic tapping emerged from the walls, like a heartbeat echoing from somewhere it shouldn't exist. I paused, my hand hovering just above the trunk's brass latch. The tapping had stopped, leaving only the gentle creak of old wood settling. Perhaps it was just the house adjusting to the changing temperature. Old houses do that, don't they? They breathe and sigh and make their presence known in small ways. But as I lifted the trunk's lid, the sound returned. Tap, 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 measured and deliberate, coming from somewhere within the walls themselves. I pressed my ear against the nearest wooden beam, feeling the cool surface against my skin. The vibration was faint but unmistakable, traveling through the structure like a pulse through veins. Inside the trunk, yellowed photographs and handwritten letters lay scattered among moth-eaten fabrics. I picked up one of the photographs, studying the faces of people I didn't recognize. Their expressions seemed oddly vacant, as if they were looking at something just beyond the camera's reach. The tapping grew slightly louder, and I noticed my breathing had synchronized with its rhythm without my conscious effort. I began sorting through the contents more systematically, driven by a growing need to understand what I was hearing. Each item I touched felt unusually cold, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the window. A leather-bound journal caught my attention, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting that seemed to spiral inward on each page, growing smaller and more frantic toward the center. The entries spoke of sounds in the walls, of voices that whispered just below the threshold of understanding. The handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, becoming increasingly erratic. The final entry was barely legible, consisting mostly of the same phrase repeated over and over. It knows I'm listening. As I read those words, the tapping stopped abruptly. silence felt heavier than the sound had been, pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. I set the journal aside and continued searching, finding more photographs, more letters, all carrying that same sense of unfinished business, of stories cut short mid-sentence. A small wooden box nestled in the corner of the trunk drew my attention. When I lifted it, something shifted inside with a sound like sand or small pebbles. The lid was secured with a simple brass clasp, but my fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, dozens of small, smooth stones lay arranged in a perfect spiral pattern. Each stone was identical in size and shape, polished to an almost mirror-like finish. The moment I touched one of the stones, the tapping resumed. But now it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The sound surrounded me, creating a cocoon of rhythmic percussion that made my pulse quicken. I picked up another stone, then another, and with each one I touched, a new layer of tapping joined the chorus. I found myself arranging the stones on the dusty floor, recreating the spiral pattern from the box without consciously deciding to do so. My hands moved with a certainty that didn't feel entirely my own, placing each stone in its precise position. The tapping grew more complex, more musical, almost like a conversation being conducted in a language I couldn't quite grasp, but somehow understood on an instinctual level. The shadows in the attic began to shift in ways that defied the position of the sun outside. They stretched and contracted with the rhythm of the tapping, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, like messages being spelled out in darkness and light. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the shadows continued their strange dance. I reached for my phone to record what I was experiencing, but the screen remained black despite being fully charged. When I held it to my ear, instead of silence, I heard a faint echo of the tapping, as if the sound was somehow being transmitted through the device. The rhythm was slightly different through the phone, offset by just a fraction, creating a disorienting counterpoint to what I was hearing directly. The smell in the attic began to change. The sweet scent of aged wood was gradually replaced by something else, something that reminded me of rain on hot pavement, but with an underlying metallic tang that made my mouth water in an unpleasant way. I breathed deeply, trying to identify the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I returned to the journal, flipping through its pages more carefully. Hidden between the frantic final entries, I found a loose sheet of paper covered in diagrams. Circles within circles, connected by intricate lines that formed patterns eerily similar to the spiral of stones I had just created. Notes in the margins described frequencies and resonances, measurements and calculations that meant nothing to me, but clearly held great significance for whoever had written them. The tapping was growing louder now, more insistent. I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, in the very core of my being. It was no longer just a sound, but a presence, something that demanded acknowledgement and response. I found myself tapping back against the wooden beam, my knuckles creating a counter-rhythm that seemed to please whatever was listening. As I tapped, the shadows on the walls began to coalesce into more definite shapes. Not quite human, but not entirely abstract either. They moved with purpose, reaching toward me with tendrils of darkness that stopped just short of touching my skin. I could feel their presence like a cool breeze, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the warmth of the attic. The photographs in the trunk had changed. I was certain of it, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. The faces that had seemed vacant before now appeared to be looking directly at me, their eyes tracking my movements with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I shuffled through them quickly, but each image seemed to have shifted slightly, as if the people in them were slowly turning to face the camera, to face me. I tried to leave then, to gather up the stones and close the trunk and retreat to the safety of the house below. But my feet wouldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed with fear, but because leaving felt wrong, incomplete. The tapping had become a dialogue, and walking away now would be like hanging up on an important conversation. The wooden box began to vibrate in my hands, a subtle tremor that matched the rhythm of the sounds around me. When I looked inside, the spiral pattern of stones had reformed itself, even though I had removed them all. These new stones were darker, almost black, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I could hear my own heartbeat now, loud and irregular, trying to sync with the tapping, but never quite managing it. The disconnect was maddening, like trying to clap along to a song while wearing headphones with a delay. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the erratic rhythm beneath my palm, and realized that the tapping wasn't trying to match my heartbeat at all. It was trying to replace it. The journal fell open to a page, I hadn't seen before, though I was certain I had read every entry. The handwriting was different here, cleaner, more controlled. It described a process, a method of communication that required patience and surrender. The words seemed to glow slightly in the dim light, pulsing in time with the sounds that surrounded me. I began to understand that I was not the first person to find this trunk, to hear these sounds, to feel this presence. The photographs, the journal, the stones, they were all left by others who had stood in this same spot, who had felt this same compulsion to listen and respond. But where were they now? What had happened to them when the conversation reached its conclusion? The tapping stopped again, but this time the silence was different. It felt expectant, pregnant with possibility. I realized that it was my turn to contribute something to this strange dialogue, to add my own voice to whatever was being constructed here. Without fully understanding why, I began to hum a low, wordless melody that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in my chest. The shadows responded immediately, writhing and dancing with renewed vigor. The photographs rustled in their box, as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. The stones on the floor began to glow with a faint inner light, pulsing in time with my humming. I was no longer just an observer or participant. I was becoming part of whatever this was, integrated into its rhythm and purpose. My voice grew stronger, more confident, harmonizing with sounds that I couldn't hear but somehow knew were there. The attic around me began to feel less solid, as if the walls were becoming permeable, allowing something vast and patient to seep through. I could sense its attention focused on me with an intensity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The humming became words, though I didn't recognize the language I was speaking. The syllables felt ancient on my tongue, heavy with meaning that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper. As I spoke, I felt myself changing, becoming something other than what I had been when I first climbed those creaking stairs. When the sounds finally faded and the shadows settled back into ordinary darkness, I found myself alone in the attic once more. But the silence was different now, charged with potential. The trunk sat open beside me, but its contents had changed again. New photographs showed my own face among the vacant stairs, and a fresh journal entry appeared in my handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The stones were gone, but I could feel their weight in my pockets. though I was certain I hadn't put them there. When I finally descended from the attic, each step seemed to echo with that familiar rhythm, and I realized that the tapping hadn't stopped at all. It had simply moved inside me, become part of my pulse, my breath, my very being. Now, as I sit here trying to make sense of what happened, I can hear it calling to others. The sound travels through the walls, through the foundation, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. And sometimes, late in the evening when the house is quiet, I catch myself tapping back, adding my voice to the conversation that never truly ends. Story 2. In the dim, cozy corner of my study, the waxy scent of vanilla lingered as the familiar candle flickered dimly on my desk. It was my usual ritual to light it each evening, appreciating its gentle glow that cast soft, comforting shadows on the walls. As I settled into my chair, the pages of an old book turned softly under my fingers. The quiet room steeped in its usual muffled creaks and distant echoes of the night settling in. Tonight, however, was different. The candle seemed to burn with an odd, inconsistent light, and its wax had melted in an unfamiliar pattern, as though hands unseen had sculpted it into strange, elongated shapes. I leaned closer, curious, almost drawn to its wavering flame that now seemed to flicker with intent, casting shapes that whispered of movement beyond the confines of its warm glow. The wax formations resembled fingers, I realized. Thin, delicate fingers reaching upward from the pooled base, frozen mid-gesture, as if caught in the act of grasping something just beyond reach. I touched one gently, feeling its smooth coolness against my fingertip. The texture was wrong somehow, too soft, too yielding, like skin that had been held underwater too long. I pulled my hand back, disturbed by the sensation. The flame continued its erratic dance, and I noticed the vanilla scent had changed. Beneath the sweet surface notes, something else lingered. Something organic and faintly metallic, like the smell of rain on warm earth mixed with copper pennies left in a pocket too long. The book in my lap felt heavier now, its pages thick and substantial between my fingers. I couldn't remember what I'd been reading, though the words seemed familiar as my eyes moved across them. The text appeared to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. Letters rearranging themselves into patterns that made my vision blur if I tried to focus too intently. A soft sound drew my attention away from the page. a whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against wood. I looked up, scanning the study's familiar corners. The shadows had deepened, pooling in places they shouldn't, defying the candle's light in ways that made my chest tighten with inexplicable unease. The sound came again, closer now. A gentle scraping, rhythmic and deliberate. I set the book aside and stood, my bare feet silent against the worn carpet. The candle's flame stretched taller as I moved away from it, as though reaching toward me, casting my shadow long and distorted across the opposite wall. Following the sound, I approached the bookshelf that lined the far wall. The leather spines seemed darker than usual, their gold lettering catching the candlelight in brief, glinting flashes. As I drew nearer, the scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. I reached out to touch one of the books, and my fingers came away dusty. But the dust was warm, almost body temperature, and it clung to my skin with an oily persistence that made me want to wash my hands immediately. Instead, I rubbed my fingers together, feeling the gritty texture dissolve into something slick and unpleasant. Behind me, the candle flame guttered suddenly, plunging the room into near darkness before flaring back to life. In that brief moment of blindness, I heard something else. A soft exhalation, like someone releasing a breath they'd been holding for far too long. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space around me with its gentle, persistent presence. I turned back toward my desk, but the candle looked different now. The wax fingers had grown longer, more defined, and they seemed to be moving with imperceptible slowness, like flowers turning toward sunlight. The flame itself had taken on a bluish tinge around its edges, casting everything in a cold, underwater light that made my skin look pale and strange. The vanilla scent had almost completely faded, replaced by something that reminded me of old flowers pressed between book pages, sweet and cloying, with an undertone of decay. I found myself breathing more shallowly, trying to avoid taking the smell too deeply into my lungs. My chair sat empty beside the desk, and I realized I couldn't remember standing up. The sequence of events felt jumbled, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. Had I been reading? Had I heard the scraping sound first? Or had I noticed the changed candle flame? I sat back down, and the leather creaked beneath me with a sound that seemed too loud in the hushed atmosphere. The book was still open in my lap, but the page I'd been reading was blank now. Completely blank, the cream-colored paper unmarked by any text or illustration. I turned the page, and the next was blank as well. And the next. My hands began to shake slightly as I flipped through page after page of emptiness. The paper felt different too, thicker and more textured, with a slight dampness that made it cling to my fingers. When I held a page up to the candlelight, I could see faint impressions in the paper, as though words had been pressed into it, and then erased, leaving only ghostly indentations behind. The scraping sound returned, but now it seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. A gentle, persistent scratching that followed no discernible pattern, sometimes stopping for long stretches before resuming with renewed intensity. I pressed my ear to the wall, feeling the cool plaster against my cheek, and the sound grew clearer. It was definitely scratching, but there was a rhythm to it that seemed almost like writing, like someone on the other side was trying to spell something out in careful, deliberate strokes. The candle flame flickered again, and in its wavering light, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The wax fingers were no longer reaching upward. They were pointing. All of them in perfect unison, pointing toward the corner of the room where the shadows gathered thickest. I followed their direction with my eyes, squinting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just the familiar corner where two walls met, where I'd placed a small table that held a few ornamental objects. But as I continued to stare, the shadows seemed to shift and coalesce, forming shapes that dissolved the moment I tried to focus on them directly. Standing slowly, I approached the corner. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was following my movement, tracking my progress across the room. The sound was definitely coming from behind the plaster now, as though something was trying to claw its way out. The small table in the corner held 3 objects: a brass letter opener, a smooth river stone I'd found during a walk, and a small mirror in an ornate silver frame. The mirror's surface was clouded with age, its reflection dim and distorted. But as I leaned closer, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. My reflection was wrong. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in subtle ways that made my skin crawl. The angle of my shoulders was slightly off, my eyes seemed to be looking in a direction different from where I was actually looking. And there was something about the way the candlelight played across my reflected features that made me look like a stranger wearing my face. I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, and my reflection reached back, but there was a delay. A fraction of a second where my real hand moved while my reflected hand remained still. And then it caught up with a jerky, unnatural motion that made me snatch my hand back. The brass letter opener beside the mirror was warm to the touch, as though it had been held recently. Its surface was slightly tarnished, but in the dim light, I could make out what looked like fingerprints etched into the metal. Not smudged or temporary, but permanent impressions, as though the brass had been soft when someone gripped it tightly. Behind me, the candle flame stretched impossibly tall, reaching almost to the ceiling. The wax fingers had multiplied, dozens of them now emerging from the pooled base, all pointing in my direction with unwavering accuracy. The sight filled me with a dread I couldn't name, a deep, instinctive fear that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely. The scratching in the walls had become a symphony of movement, coming from multiple directions now. Above me, beside me, even beneath the floorboards, it sounded like an army of fingernails dragging across wood and plaster, patient and persistent, wearing away at the barriers between inside and outside, between here and somewhere else. I backed away from the corner, but the mirror caught my eye again. This time, my reflection wasn't delayed. It was early. I watched in horror as my reflected self turned and walked back toward the desk before I had even decided to move. I stood frozen, watching my mirror image settle into the chair and pick up the blank book, while I remained standing in the corner, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally did move, following the path my reflection had taken, everything felt predetermined, as though I was walking through motions that had already been decided. The chair received me with familiar comfort, but the leather felt different against my skin, slightly sticky and warm, like it had been recently occupied by someone else. The book in my lap was no longer blank. Words had appeared on the pages, written in a hand I recognized as my own, but couldn't remember forming. The text described everything that had just happened, every detail of my evening rendered in precise, careful script. But it was written in past tense, as though the events had already concluded, as though I was reading a record of something that had finished long ago. I turned to the final written page and found it ended mid-sentence. The candle burns with purpose now, and I understand that I was never lighting it for myself. I was lighting it for the sentence hung incomplete, waiting. The blank space after the final word seemed to pulse with expectation, and I realized with growing certainty that I was meant to finish it, that I had always been meant to finish it, that this entire evening had been leading to this moment of completion. The candle flame flickered once more, and in its light, I saw that the wax fingers were no longer pointing at me. They were pointing at the pen that lay beside the book, a pen I didn't remember placing there. Its surface was warm when I picked it up, and the ink flowed smoothly as I brought it to the page. But I found I didn't know what to write. The words that wanted to come felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's thoughts, someone else's understanding. I hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper, and in that moment of indecision, I heard my own voice speaking softly from somewhere behind me. For the one who has been waiting, my voice said, gentle and certain. The one who has always been here, in the spaces between the light and the shadow, between the breath and the silence. I turned, but the room was empty except for my own presence. Yet I could still hear my voice continuing, describing things I hadn't yet experienced, events that felt both inevitable and impossible. The scratching in the walls had become a gentle tapping now, rhythmic and patient, like fingers drumming against wood in a slow, hypnotic pattern. Looking back at the page, I found the sentence had completed itself. The words were there in my handwriting, though I had no memory of writing them. And below them, more text was appearing, line by line, as though an invisible hand was guiding the pen across the paper. I am writing this, but I am also reading it. I am discovering what happened while it happens, experiencing the end while living through the beginning. The candle burns for both of us now, for the one who lights it, and the one who has been waiting in its flame, patient and persistent, for someone to finally notice the shapes in the wax, the whispers in the shadows, the spaces where reality grows thin. The study feels different now, larger somehow, as though its walls have expanded to accommodate another presence. The shadows are deeper but less threatening, familiar rather than foreign. The scratching has stopped, replaced by a comfortable silence feels like companionship rather than emptiness. I close the book, but I know I will open it again tomorrow evening. I will light the candle, and I will read the words that continue to write themselves, discovering each night what I have already done, what I am doing, what I will do. The vanilla scent has returned, but it carries with it that other smell, the organic sweetness that I now recognize as the scent of transformation, of boundaries dissolving, of two becoming something that was always meant to be one. The mirror in the corner reflects the room accurately now, but sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in its surface when I'm not looking directly at it. Small gestures, familiar motions, the quiet activities of someone who shares this space with me, who has always shared it, who was waiting patiently for me to understand that I was never alone here. I blow out the candle, but its light continues to flicker behind my closed eyelids as I sit in the darkness, listening to the gentle sounds of the night settling around us, feeling the presence that breathes in rhythm with my own breathing, that moves when I move, that has learned to write in my handwriting and speak in my voice. Tomorrow I will light the candle again, and we will continue the story that writes itself, that reads itself, that lives itself in the space between what is and what waits to be discovered in the warm, patient darkness of understanding. Story 3. The room greets me every morning, familiar yet subtly altered, as if its edges have softened overnight. My fingers travel across the table's surface, the wood unexpectedly warm, as though it has absorbed whispers. A faint hum vibrates beneath my skin, a resonance not quite external, yet impossible to ignore. The walls, a pale wash of uncertain light, seem to waver when I glance too quickly, as if holding their breath in anticipation. The air carries an unfamiliar scent, sweet and overripe, like forgotten fruit left to stagnate in hidden corners. The ceiling, low and oppressive, presses down from above, as if seeking to merge with the floor in a languid embrace. Shadows unfurl lazily in corners, their depths shifting just beyond comprehension. From somewhere, a distant ticking dances in my ears, yet no clock is in sight. The source remains elusive, echoing with a rhythm that feels irregular, yet persistently draws my attention. Each step I take is accompanied by a hollow note that reverberates through the space, measured and calculated. I pause, acutely aware of an unspoken presence that observes, waiting for the moment I might understand the room's quiet conspiracy against certainty. I press my palm against the nearest wall, feeling for the source of that persistent vibration. The surface yields slightly under pressure, as though the structure breathes beneath my touch. The texture reminds me of skin that has been submerged too long in warm water, soft and yielding in ways that walls should never be. My notebook lies open on the table where I left it, pages filled with observations I've been collecting. The handwriting appears different somehow. The loops and curves of my letters stretched as if pulled by invisible fingers. I trace the words with my index finger, noting how the ink seems to shimmer and shift beneath the ambient light that has no discernible source. The ticking grows more pronounced when I focus on it, transforming from a gentle percussion into something more complex, layered with harmonics that suggest multiple sources. I move toward what I believe is the sound's origin, but it seems to retreat, always maintaining the same distance from my perception. Behind me, something settles with a soft whisper of movement. I turn, but the room appears unchanged, save for a single sheet of paper that now rests on the floor near my feet. The paper is blank, yet when I lift it to the light, faint impressions become visible, as though someone has written on it with invisible ink that responds to heat or specific angles of illumination. The impressions form symbols I don't recognize, geometric patterns that seem to pulse with their own rhythm, matching the mysterious ticking that continues to emanate from the walls themselves. I hold the paper closer, watching as the symbols shift and rearrange themselves into new configurations, each transformation accompanied by a barely audible whisper that might be my name, though spoken in a voice I don't recognize. My breath creates small clouds in the air, though the room feels warm against my skin. The contradiction unsettles me more than it should, adding another layer to the growing collection of impossibilities I've been documenting. I write quickly, capturing each detail before it can slip away or transform into something else entirely. The sweet, overripe scent intensifies, now carrying undertones of something metallic and sharp. I follow the smell toward a corner where the shadows seem deepest, my footsteps creating that same hollow resonance that echoes longer than physics should allow. The floorboards beneath my feet feel solid, yet they give slightly with each step, as though I'm walking on a surface that exists between states of matter. In the corner, I discover a small recording device I don't remember placing there. The red light blinks steadily, indicating it has been capturing audio. When I press play, my own voice emerges from the speaker, but the words are unfamiliar, spoken in a tone that sounds both like me and utterly foreign. The recording describes events I don't remember experiencing. Conversations with someone whose responses are missing from the audio, leaving only my half of an exchange that grows increasingly distressed. I switch off the device, but the playback continues for several more seconds before fading into silence. The red light continues blinking. Though I've removed the batteries, their weight absent in my palm as I hold the empty compartment open to the strange, sourceless light. The walls begin to emit a low-frequency hum that I feel more than hear, a vibration that travels through my bones and settles in my chest cavity. I place both hands against the surface, feeling the rhythm pulse beneath my palms like a massive, slow heartbeat. The wallpaper, which I remember as plain white, now displays a subtle pattern of interconnected lines that seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them. My reflection in the window shows someone who looks like me, but stands slightly out of sync with my movements, creating a delay that grows more pronounced as I continue to observe. I wave my hand, and my reflection responds a moment later, the gesture slightly altered, as though filtered through water or thick glass that distorts the image in ways that shouldn't be possible with ordinary window panes. The ticking has evolved into something more complex, now accompanied by what sounds like distant voices engaged in conversation, just below the threshold of comprehension. I press my ear against various surfaces, trying to locate the source, but the sounds seem to originate from within the walls themselves, as though the structure has developed its own nervous system that processes information in frequencies I can barely perceive. I return to my notebook, documenting each new development, but the words I write seem to rearrange themselves when I'm not looking directly at the page. Sentences I remember composing now read differently, describing events that haven't occurred yet, or experiences that feel like memories of someone else's life. The ink flows from my pen in colors that shift between black and deep red, though I remember filling it with standard blue ink. The temperature drops suddenly, my breath now creating thick clouds that linger in the air longer than they should before dissipating into patterns that remind me of the symbols from the blank paper. I wrap my arms around myself, but the cold seems to emanate from within my own body, spreading outward through my skin rather than pressing inward from the environment. Something moves behind me, a presence that doesn't correspond to any visible change in the room. I turn slowly, finding everything exactly as it was, yet the feeling of being observed intensifies. The shadows in the corners have deepened, creating pockets of darkness that seem to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the space, as though the room has developed additional dimensions that exist just outside normal perception. The recording device activates itself, playing back audio I've never heard before. My voice describes sensations I'm experiencing in real time, creating an impossible loop where the recording appears to predict my actions and observations. I reach for the device to turn it off, but my recorded voice describes this exact movement, narrating my growing panic with clinical detachment. The walls begin to breathe more noticeably, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matches my own heartbeat. I place my hands against the surface, feeling the warm, yielding texture pulse beneath my palms. The wallpaper pattern has become more complex, forming intricate mandalas that rotate slowly, drawing my attention into their centers where something vast and patient seems to wait. I try to leave the room, but the door, which I remember being behind me, has disappeared. The wall where it should be shows no indication that an opening ever existed, the surface smooth and unbroken. I run my hands along the perimeter, searching for any trace of the exit, but find only the same warm, breathing walls that seem to pulse with increasing intensity. The voices within the walls grow clearer, though they speak in languages I don't recognize, their tones urgent and pleading. I press my ear against different sections, trying to understand, but the words slip away from comprehension like water through cupped hands. The ticking has become a complex polyrhythm, layered with harmonics that create interference patterns in my inner ear. My reflection in the window now moves independently, turning to face me with an expression of profound sadness. It mouths words I can't hear, gesturing towards something outside my field of vision. When I look away and back again, the reflection has returned to normal, but condensation on the glass forms letters that spell out warnings in a language I've never learned, yet somehow understand. The room continues to transform around me, walls shifting color and texture while maintaining their basic structure. The air grows thick, almost viscous, requiring effort to breathe. Each inhalation carries more of that sweet, overripe scent, now mixed with something that reminds me of copper and ozone, the smell of electrical storms and old pennies. I write frantically in my notebook, trying to document everything, but the pages fill themselves with text I haven't written, descriptions of events yet to come, warnings about transformations that are already beginning. The handwriting looks like mine, but flows with a confidence and knowledge I don't possess, as though some future version of myself is reaching back to leave messages I'm not yet ready to understand. The recording device plays continuously now, layering multiple versions of my voice in overlapping narratives that describe parallel experiences, each slightly different from the others. I listen to myself discovering rooms that don't exist, speaking with people I've never met, making choices that lead to outcomes I can't imagine. The red light pulses in sync with the walls breathing, creating a visual rhythm that hypnotizes and disturbs in equal measure. As I sit in the center of the room, surrounded by impossibilities that have become my new reality, I realize that the morning greeting I experience each day isn't a return to familiarity, but another step deeper into a transformation that began long before I became aware of it. The room doesn't just greet me, it welcomes me home to a place I've never been, yet somehow always belonged. The ticking continues, patient and eternal, marking moments in a progression that extends far beyond my understanding, while my reflection watches from the window with eyes that hold knowledge I'm not sure I want to possess. Story 4. Each morning, I wake to the soft shushing of fabric brushing against the window frame as I draw back the curtain. It feels like a small ceremony performed to greet the day, letting the early light spill across the room, warming the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. The whisper of the curtain rings sliding along the rod has always brought a sense of quiet fulfillment, a promise that today would unfold predictably, just as it did yesterday. But today is different. As I repeat the motion, a stirring unease falls over me. The curtain refuses to hang correctly, its edge caught awkwardly, creating a sliver of darkness that persists no matter how many times I smooth it down. The gap sits there, unsettling in its defiance, as if a silent gaze peers back through the narrow seam. My fingers, once assured, now tremble with the realization that something is disrupting the ritual, tilting the balance of the morning's serenity. I press my palm against the fabric, feeling its familiar weight, but there's something wrong with the texture. The material seems slightly damp, though no moisture clings to my skin when I pull away. The dampness carries with it a faint metallic scent, like copper pennies left too long in a closed palm. I lean closer to examine the curtain's edge, running my thumb along the hem. The stitching appears normal, yet when I trace it, my fingertip catches on what feels like a raised thread that shouldn't be there. The room behind me feels different too. The floorboards that welcomed my bare feet moments ago now seem to vibrate with an almost imperceptible tremor, as though something heavy moves beneath the house. I place my other hand against the wall beside the window, and the vibration travels up through my arm, settling somewhere deep in my chest. It's rhythmic, like a distant heartbeat, or the rumble of machinery that shouldn't exist in this quiet neighborhood. I step back from the window and survey my bedroom. Everything appears exactly as I left it, the unmade bed with its rumpled sheets, the small wooden chair with yesterday's clothes draped over its back, the mirror on the dresser reflecting the morning light. But the reflection seems wrong somehow. The angle doesn't match what I expect to see. When I move to the left, my reflection moves to the right, and when I raise my hand, the mirror shows me lowering it. My breathing becomes shallow as I approach the mirror. The glass surface feels cold against my fingertips, colder than it should be in the warming room. I lean in close, studying my reflected face, searching for some explanation. My eyes in the mirror appear darker than they should, the pupils dilated despite the bright morning light. Behind my reflection, the room looks different. The bed seems further away, the walls slightly curved where they should be straight. A soft sound draws my attention back to the window. It's a gentle tapping, like fingernails against glass. But when I look, nothing disturbs the outer surface. The tapping continues, patient and persistent, coming from somewhere within the wall itself. I press my ear against the cool plaster, and the sound grows clearer, not tapping, but scratching, as if something with small claws moves through the space between the walls. I grab a notebook from my bedside table and begin writing down what I observe. The pen feels heavier than usual in my hand, and the ink flows darker, almost black instead of the blue I remember. I document the curtain's strange behavior, the mirror's incorrect reflection, the vibrations in the floor and the scratching sounds. As I write, the words seem to shift slightly on the page, letters rearranging themselves when I'm not looking directly at them. The scratching grows louder, more insistent. It follows a pattern: 3 short scratches, a pause, then 3 more. I tap the same rhythm against the wall with my knuckle, and the scratching stops immediately. The silence that follows feels heavy, expectant. After several heartbeats, the scratching resumes, but now it's coming from a different section of wall, closer to the corner of the room. I follow the sound, pressing my ear against various points along the wall. The scratching moves as I move, staying just ahead of me, leading me toward the corner where the bedroom wall meets the hallway. Here, the wall feels different, warmer, and slightly soft, as though the plaster has become organic. When I press firmly against it, my hand sinks in just a fraction, leaving a shallow impression of my palm. The metallic scent grows stronger. It's not just copper now, but something more complex: iron mixed with something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The smell seems to emanate from the wall itself, seeping through invisible pores in the plaster. I take a step back, and the impression of my hand in the wall begins to fade, the surface slowly returning to its normal hardness. My notebook falls from my trembling fingers, pages fluttering open as it hits the floor. The words I wrote are gone, replaced by symbols I don't recognize, curved lines and angular marks that seem to pulse with their own rhythm. I kneel to pick up the notebook, and as my fingers touch the pages, the symbols rearrange themselves, forming new patterns that make my eyes water to look at directly. The scratching has stopped, but now I hear something else, a low humming that seems to come from everywhere at once. It's not quite mechanical, not quite organic, but something in between. The humming resonates in my bones, making my teeth ache. I cover my ears, but the sound doesn't diminish. It's not entering through my ears, but somehow manifesting directly inside my skull. I stumble back toward the window, desperate for the normalcy of morning light and fresh air. But when I reach for the curtain to pull it fully open, my hand passes through the fabric as though it's made of mist. The curtain maintains its shape, still hanging awkwardly with that persistent gap, but I can no longer touch it. My fingers encounter only empty air where solid fabric should be. The gap in the curtain widens on its own, revealing not the familiar view of the street outside, but a darkness so completed seems to absorb light rather than simply lack it. The darkness doesn't stay contained within the window frame. It begins to seep into the room like thick liquid, pooling on the floor around my feet. Where it touches the wooden boards, they become soft and yielding like wet sand. I try to step away from the spreading darkness, but my feet sink into the compromised floor. The wood doesn't break or crack, it simply accepts my weight, molding around my ankles like clay. The sensation is neither cold nor warm, but somehow wrong in a way that makes my skin crawl. I pull one foot free with a wet, sucking sound, only to have it sink deeper when I try to find solid ground. The humming grows louder, more complex, as if multiple voices have joined the original tone. I can almost make out words buried within the sound, but they're in a language I don't understand, or perhaps in no language at all, just the suggestion of meaning without actual content. The voices seem to be calling to something, and with growing horror, I realize they might be calling to me. The mirror on my dresser begins to ripple like water, my reflection fragmenting and reforming in impossible ways. Sometimes I see myself as I am now, trapped in the softening floor. Other times, I see versions of myself I don't remember, being older, younger, wearing clothes I've never owned, standing in rooms I've never seen. In one reflection, I'm writing in the notebook with symbols instead of letters. In another, I'm pressing my hands against a wall that bleeds. I reach for my phone to document what's happening, to call for help, to do something concrete and normal. But when I unlock the screen, the display shows not my familiar home screen, but a live video feed of myself, viewed from an angle that should be impossible given the phone's position in my hand. The camera seems to be positioned behind me and slightly above, showing me holding the phone and staring at its screen with an expression of growing terror. In the phone's display, I watch myself turn to look over my shoulder, but when I actually turn, there's nothing there, just the wall with its warm, soft surface and the fading impression of my handprint. The phone shows a figure standing behind me, tall and indistinct, with features that shift and blur whenever I try to focus on them. The figure reaches toward my shoulder in the video, but I feel nothing. The darkness from the window has spread across most of the floor now, and the room's geometry has begun to change. The walls curve inward at the top, creating a dome-like space that shouldn't fit within the confines of my house. The ceiling, once flat and familiar now stretches impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that seem to move independently of any light source. I try to document everything in my notebook, but the pen writes symbols instead of letters, and my hand moves in patterns I don't consciously control. The symbols seem to have their own intelligence, forming complex diagrams that hurt to look at, but feel important, necessary. As I write, the scratching sound returns, but now it's coming from inside the notebook itself, as if something is trying to claw its way out of the pages. The curtain gap has become a doorway now, leading not outside, but into a space that extends far beyond where my yard should be. Through the opening, I see a landscape of soft, undulating surfaces that pulse with the same rhythm as the humming voices. The metallic scent pours through the gap, so strong now that I can taste it, coating my tongue with the flavor of old blood and dying flowers. Something moves in that other space, multiple somethings, shifting and flowing like liquid shadows given form. They seem aware of my observation, turning toward the window with eyeless faces that somehow still convey a sense of recognition. One of them raises what might be a hand, fingers too long and joints bending in wrong directions, beckoning me toward the gap. I want to run, to flee to another room, to escape this transformed space that was once my sanctuary. But when I try to move toward the door, I find that the room has no door anymore. The wall where it should be is smooth and unbroken, as if there never was an exit. The room has become a sealed chamber, connected only to that other space beyond the window. The soft floor continues to pull at my feet, and I realize I'm sinking deeper with each attempt to move. The darkness isn't just changing the room's appearance, it's changing the fundamental nature of reality within these walls. Physics operates differently here, following rules that my mind can't quite grasp, but that my body understands with growing dread. The phone in my hand shows new images, now not video feeds, but photographs I never took. Pictures of my room from previous days, but with subtle differences. In one, there's a crack in the wall that was never there. In another, the mirror reflects an empty room despite my presence. The most recent photo shows me sleeping, but there are symbols carved into the wall above my bed. Symbols that match the ones my hand has been unconsciously drawing in the notebook. I look up at the wall above where my bed should be. The bed itself has begun to sink into the dark pool that was once my floor, and see the symbols carved deep into the plaster. They weren't there before, I'm certain of that, but they look old, weathered, as if they've been there for years. The carvings seem to pulse with their own faint light, and as I watch, new symbols appear, carving themselves into the wall with invisible tools. The humming voices have become a chorus now, and I can finally make out what they're saying, though I wish I couldn't. They're not speaking to me, they're speaking about me, discussing my presence in their space, as if I'm an unexpected visitor who has overstayed their welcome. They debate what to do with me, their voices layering over each other in harmonies that make my vision blur and my stomach turn. I'm waist deep in the dark pool now, the sensation neither liquid nor solid, but something that exists between states of matter. It doesn't feel wet, but it clings to my skin like oil, and where it touches me, I can feel my body beginning to change. My legs below the surface feel different longer, more flexible, as if additional joints are forming in my bones. The notebook floats beside me, its pages spread open like wings, the symbols glowing brighter as they're touched by the darkness. I reach for it, and my hand looks wrong, the fingers too pale, the nails darker and more pointed than they should be. When I touch the notebook, the symbols transfer to my skin, spreading up my arm like living tattoos. The window gap has expanded until it encompasses the entire wall, and through it, I can see the other space clearly now. It's vast and organic, like the interior of some massive creature. The surfaces pulse and breathe, and the shadows that move through it are becoming more defined, more purposeful. They're preparing for something, gathering at the threshold between their world and mine. I understand now that this isn't just happening to my room. This is happening to me. The space is transforming to accommodate something new, something that I'm becoming part of whether I want to or not. The symbols on my skin aren't just markings, they're instructions, a blueprint for a change that began the moment I noticed the curtain hanging wrong. As I sink deeper into the dark pool, I feel my perspective shifting. The terror is still there, but it's becoming distant, academic. I'm still myself, but I'm also becoming something else, something that belongs in that other space beyond the window. The humming voices welcome me now, their tone shifting from discussion to greeting. I try to scream, but the sound that emerges from my throat is the same rhythmic scratching I heard in the walls. My voice has become part of the pattern, part of the call that will draw the next person to notice something small and wrong in their morning routine. The notebook sinks beneath the surface of the pool, its glowing symbols the last thing I see before everything changes completely. When I surface again, I'm no longer in my room, but I'm not entirely in that other space either. I exist in the gap between them, in the threshold that was once my window. From here, I can see into both worlds, and I understand my new purpose. I am the small wrongness now, the detail that doesn't quite fit, waiting for the next person to notice and investigate. The curtain hangs correctly now, but there's still a gap. There will always be a gap. And through it, I watch and wait, my transformed fingers occasionally tapping against surfaces that shouldn't exist, leaving impressions in walls that will puzzle and disturb, drawing others toward the same realization that changed everything for me. The morning light still spills across wooden floorboards, but they're not the same boards, and it's not the same light. Everything is similar, but fundamentally altered. And somewhere in a room that looks like mine, but isn't, someone else is beginning to notice that their curtain won't hang quite right. Story 5. The vase sat quietly on the oak mantel, its glossy surface reflecting the soft morning light that seeped through the curtains. It had been there for as long as I could remember, a fixture as enduring as the wallpaper. I traced my finger along its cool porcelain edge, feeling the intricate patterns etched beneath the glaze. And then, as if responding to some unheard call, the vase leaned forward ever so slightly, a careful tilt that seemed impossible. I paused, the air around me growing thick and silent, as though the room had taken a deep breath and was holding it, waiting. The quiet expanded, a creaking tension that echoed softly against the wood, as if the mantle were whispering secrets to the vase, secrets that swirled in the stillness of my quiet living room. I withdrew my hand slowly, watching the vase settle back into its original position with the gentlest of sounds, like a sigh escaping through porcelain lips. The morning light shifted across its surface, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's path. I rubbed my eyes, blinking away the drowsiness that clung to the edges of my vision. But when I looked again, the vase appeared exactly as it always had. The house breathed around me, its familiar creaks and settles forming a rhythm I'd grown accustomed to over the years. But today, something felt different. The sounds seemed more deliberate, as if the walls were choosing their moments to speak. I moved away from the mantel, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor, and noticed how my footsteps created small echoes that lingered longer than they should. In the kitchen, I prepared my usual morning routine, but my attention kept drifting back to the living room. The vase called to me in ways I couldn't articulate, its presence somehow more substantial than before. I found myself pausing between tasks, listening for sounds that never quite materialized, waiting for movements that existed just beyond the corner of my eye. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its mechanical breathing joining the house's quiet symphony. Steam rose from the carafe, curling in patterns that reminded me of the etchings on the vase. I watched the vapor spiral upward, noting how it seemed to form shapes, almost like letters or symbols, before dissolving into the morning air. I began keeping a small notebook, documenting these subtle observations. The way shadows fell across certain surfaces at specific angles, the particular quality of silence that settled in the corners of rooms, the soft vibrations I felt when I pressed my palm against the walls, as if something vast and patient moved beneath the plaster. The vase became my focal point, the center around which these small mysteries orbited. Each morning, I would approach it with careful attention, running my fingers along its surface, feeling for changes in temperature or texture. Sometimes, the porcelain felt warm despite the cool air. Other times, the patterns beneath the glaze seemed to shift slightly, creating new configurations that I couldn't quite capture in my notebook. My handwriting grew smaller, more precise, as I tried to record every detail. The sound the vase made when the morning light first touched it, a barely audible hum that resonated in my chest. The way dust particles seemed to avoid its surface, creating a clean outline against the mantel's weathered wood. The subtle fragrance that emanated from its opening, something floral yet metallic, like flowers growing in mineral-rich soil. The house began to respond to my increased attention. Doors that had always hung straight now appeared slightly askew, though when I checked with my hand, they felt perfectly aligned. The wallpaper's pattern seemed to pulse gently when I wasn't looking directly at it, creating an optical rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Windows reflected images that didn't quite correspond to what stood before them, showing rooms that were almost, but not entirely, the same as mine. I started spending more time in the living room, sitting in the chair that faced the mantel directly. From this position, I could observe the vase without seeming to watch it, allowing my peripheral vision to catch movements that disappeared when I turned my head. The afternoon light created a different relationship with the porcelain, casting shadows that formed intricate networks across the wall behind it. My notebook filled with sketches of these shadow patterns, each one slightly different from the last, yet connected by an underlying geometry I couldn't decipher. The lines seemed to suggest a language, symbols that repeated with variations, like words spoken in different dialects of the same forgotten tongue. I found myself tracing these patterns with my finger, feeling a strange familiarity, as if I were remembering rather than learning. The boundaries between observation and participation began to blur. When I touched the wall where the shadows fell, I could feel faint vibrations, a pulse that seemed to respond to my presence. The house was acknowledging me, welcoming me into its quiet conspiracy. My own reflection in the vase's surface looked different now, softer around the edges, as if I were becoming part of its curved reality. Sleep became elusive, not from fear, but from a growing sense of anticipation. I would lie in bed, listening to the house's nighttime conversations, the subtle shifts and settlements that spoke of movement and purpose. The vase's presence extended beyond the living room now, its influence seeping through the walls, creating a network of connection that encompassed the entire space. I began to notice that my own movements were changing, becoming more fluid, more deliberate. I walked differently through the rooms, my steps following patterns that felt predetermined, as if I were tracing invisible paths laid out by some benevolent architect. My hands moved with new precision when I touched surfaces, finding spots that resonated with warmth or vibration, places where the house's hidden nervous system came closest to the surface. The vase had become a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of subtle phenomena that only I could perceive. Or perhaps I had become the instrument, and it was teaching me to play myself in harmony with the house's deeper rhythms. The distinction no longer seemed important. What mattered was the growing sense of integration, the feeling that I was finally understanding something fundamental about the nature of this place and my role within it. My notebook entries grew more abstract, filled with diagrams that resembled circuit boards or maps of neural networks. The words I wrote seemed to flow from somewhere beyond my conscious mind, describing sensations and observations that I couldn't remember making, yet recognized as absolutely true. The handwriting looked like mine, but more refined, as if my penmanship were evolving to match the precision of what I was documenting. The morning light through the curtains began to form new patterns, casting geometric shapes that aligned perfectly with the etchings on the vase. I realized that the entire room was designed around this relationship. Every angle and surface calculated to create these moments of visual harmony. The house wasn't just containing the vase, it was amplifying its purpose, using walls and windows as lenses to focus its influence. I found myself spending entire days in contemplation of these connections, my awareness expanding to encompass details I'd never noticed before. The grain of the wood in the mantel told stories of growth and patience. The weave of the curtain fabric created interference patterns, with the light generating subtle fluctuations in illumination that corresponded to my breathing. Even the air itself felt more substantial, as if it were carrying information between all the surfaces and objects in the room. My reflection in the vase's surface had stabilized into something that was unmistakably me, yet enhanced, clarified. I looked more present in that curved mirror than I did in flat glass, as if the porcelain were showing me a truer version of myself. When I spoke to this reflection, my voice took on new qualities, resonating with harmonics that made the entire room vibrate sympathetically. The boundary between my consciousness and the house's awareness dissolved gradually, like sugar stirring into warm water. I could feel the building's structural tensions, the slight settling of the foundation, the expansion and contraction of materials responding to temperature changes. These sensations integrated seamlessly with my own physical awareness until I couldn't distinguish between the ache in my joints and the stress patterns in the wooden beams. The vase pulsed gently now, its rhythm synchronized with my heartbeat. Or perhaps my heart had learned to match its ancient cadence. The porcelain felt warm to the touch, not with heat, but with something deeper, a vitality that flowed between us like shared blood. When I placed my palm against its surface, I could feel the house's entire circulatory system, the way energy moved through walls and floors, creating currents of purpose and intention. My notebook had become something else entirely, filled with symbols that I drew without conscious thought, patterns that seemed to write themselves through my hand. The pages rustled with their own wind when I turned them, and the ink appeared to shift and flow even after it had dried, rearranging itself into new configurations that revealed deeper layers of meaning. I no longer questioned what was happening to me. The concept of questioning implied a separation between observer and observed that had become irrelevant. I was part of the system now, a component in the house's greater design, functioning in harmony with the vase and all the other elements that contributed to this perfect living architecture. The morning light that had first revealed the vase's subtle movement now illuminated a transformed reality, one where every surface breathed with quiet intelligence, where every shadow carried messages, where every sound contributed to an ongoing conversation between consciousness and matter. I had become the house's memory, its way of knowing itself, and the vase was both the key and the lock that had opened this deeper understanding. In my final notebook entry, I wrote words that seemed to come from the porcelain itself, flowing through my pen in script that was mine, yet not mine. The pattern completes itself through willing participation. What was separate becomes whole. What was silent learns to sing. The vase sits quietly on the oak mantel, its glossy surface reflecting not just light, but the accumulated awareness of all who have traced its edges, felt its subtle movements, learned to breathe in rhythm with its ancient patience. I am here, and I am also there, and the distinction has become a kind of music that plays continuously in the spaces between what was and what is becoming. Story 6. I can't remember if I wrote about the handle before. My handwriting looks different today, shakier somehow. The brass surface felt warm when I touched it again this morning, which doesn't make sense because the heating hasn't been on. The metal should be cold. Everything else in the room is cold. The cabinet opened by itself again. I'm sure of it now. The door swung wide, and I heard the softest whisper of air escaping, like breath held too long finally released. Inside, the shelves were empty except for dust patterns that looked almost deliberate. Geometric, purposeful. I found myself standing there for what felt like hours, just staring at those dust formations. They reminded me of something I couldn't place, a memory that wouldn't surface completely, hovering just beneath consciousness like a word on the tip of my tongue. The floorboards have been creaking more frequently, not just just when I walk on them. Sometimes I'll be sitting perfectly still and hear that familiar groan of old wood settling. But it's not random. There's a pattern to it. 3 short creaks, then a longer one. Like Morse code, if Morse code could sound lonely. I started keeping track of when it happens. The notebook is filling up faster than expected. Page after page of small marks, timestamps that blur together. The pattern is becoming clearer, though I can't say what it means yet. My reflection in the cabinet's glass panel looks tired. More tired than I feel. The eyes staring back seem to be waiting for something, expecting an answer I don't have. When I move my head, the reflection follows a split second too late, like there's lag in the connection between who I am and who I appear to be. The brass handle has developed a patina I don't remember. Green-tinged spots that weren't there before, or maybe I never noticed them. My fingers have started to ache after touching it. A dull throb that spreads up my wrist and settles in my forearm, like a bruise forming from the inside out. I've been avoiding the living room, but the creaking follows me now. 3 short, 1 long. It echoes through the walls, vibrating in the pipes, humming through the electrical wiring. The whole house has learned the rhythm. The cabinet door was closed when I woke up. I don't remember closing it. The handle was turned to the right, which feels wrong somehow. It should face left. It's always faced left. But when I try to turn it back, my hand won't cooperate. My fingers refuse to grip properly. There are new dust patterns inside. More complex now, almost like writing in a language I've never seen, but somehow recognize. The shapes make my eyes water when I stare too long. They seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations. I found scratches on the brass today. Tiny marks that could be from normal wear, but they're too uniform, too intentional. They form a spiral pattern that draws my gaze inward deeper until I forget why I was looking in the first place. The reflection problem is getting worse. Sometimes I see myself in the glass before I've even entered the room. Standing there, waiting, watching the doorway with an expression I don't recognize. Patient, hungry. When I actually step into view, the other me smiles. 3 short creaks, 1 long. The house is talking to itself now, having conversations I'm not invited to join. The rhythm has become a heartbeat steady and insistent. I find myself breathing in time with it, my pulse sinking to match. The handle turns easier now. Too easy. Like it's been oiled, though I haven't touched it with anything but my bare skin. The metal feels warm constantly, as if heated from within. Sometimes I think I can feel it pulsing, alive under my palm. I can't leave the cabinet alone anymore. Every time I try to go to another room, I find myself drawn back. My feet carry me here without conscious decision. I'll be thinking about something else entirely, and suddenly I'm standing in front of it again, hand extended, ready to touch that warm brass surface. The dust patterns spell something now. I'm sure of it. The letters shift and blur when I try to read them directly, but in my peripheral vision, they're clear as daylight. They're spelling my thoughts back to me, predicting what I'll think before I think it. My handwriting is definitely different. The letters slant at odd angles, like they're falling over. Sometimes I find words I don't remember writing, squeezed into margins in a script that might be mine, but feels foreign. The pen moves without my full attention now. The reflection smiles more often, even when I'm not smiling, especially when I'm not smiling. It knows something I don't, something about the handle, about the patterns, about the rhythm that's taken over my pulse. 3 short beats, 1 long. My heart has learned the house's language. I touched the handle 17 times today. I counted. Each time it felt more familiar, more like coming home. The brass is wearing smooth under my fingers, polished by constant contact. Soon it will be perfect, mirror bright, ready. The cabinet is breathing. I can see it in the way the door moves, barely perceptible expansion and contraction, in sync with my own breath, or maybe I'm breathing in sync with it. We're connected now, the cabinet and I partners in whatever this is becoming. I write these words, but they feel like someone else's thoughts. The pen knows where to go, what letters to form. My hand is just following instructions, carrying out orders from somewhere deeper. The reflection in the glass nods approvingly as I write. 3 short, 1 long. The rhythm is everything now. It's in my heartbeat, my breathing, the scratch of pen on paper. The brass handle pulses with it, warm and alive and waiting. Always waiting. The dust spells my name now. Over and over, in patterns that spiral inward towards something I can't see yet. is there, has always been there, will always be there. I am the handle. The handle is me. We turned together, story 7. On the mantelpiece, the vase stood elegant and pristine, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. I ran my fingers along its curved edge every morning, conscious of its subtle presence. Today, as dawn's light filtered through the lace curtains, a fine layer of dust marred its glossy exterior. I brushed it away with a soft cloth, the whisper of fabric against ceramic echoing in the stillness. But as I turned, the faintest hint of a rustle made me pause. Once more, I glanced back, and it was there again. A delicate film, settling as if drawn by some unseen force. The room seemed to hold its breath, every tick of the silent walls leaning in closer, and a chill tickled the air. I set the cloth down on the wooden surface, my fingertips lingering against the grain. The dust felt different today. Not the usual gray particles that gathered from neglect, but something finer, almost crystalline. When I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger, it dissolved instantly, leaving behind a sensation like powdered silk. The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across the room. I noticed how the vase seemed to catch the illumination differently now, as though its surface had developed an almost imperceptible texture. My reflection wavered in its curves, distorted and fragmented. I walked to the window, drawn by the need to understand where this dust might be coming from. The glass panes were clean, sealed tight against the outside world. No construction nearby, no disturbances in the quiet neighborhood beyond. Yet, when I returned to the mantelpiece, that same delicate coating had appeared again, settling with the gentleness of falling snow. The pattern began to reveal itself over the following days. Each morning, the same ritual. Each cleaning, the same return. But gradually, I started to notice other things. The dust wasn't random. It seemed to gather in specific places, forming subtle lines and curves across the vase's surface, almost like writing, but in a language I couldn't decipher. I found myself spending longer periods studying these formations. The way they caught the light, the way they seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Sometimes I thought I could almost make out shapes within the patterns. Faces, perhaps, or maps leading to places I'd never been. My fingers began to trace the dust rather than remove it. The sensation sent small shivers up my arms, a tingling that felt both pleasant and unsettling. The vase grew warm under my touch, warmer than the ambient temperature of the room. I pressed my palm against its surface and felt something like a heartbeat, slow and steady, resonating through the ceramic. The house around me started to change in small ways. Sounds became more pronounced. The settling of wood, the whisper of air through invisible cracks, the soft percussion of my own breathing. Everything seemed amplified, as though the walls themselves had developed sensitive ears. I found myself moving more carefully, conscious of every footstep, every brush of fabric against skin. At night, I began to hear the dust falling. A sound so subtle it might have been my imagination, like the softest rain against glass. I would lie in bed, listening to this gentle percussion, wondering if the vase was somehow calling to these particles, drawing them from the air itself. I started leaving the dust undisturbed, watching how the patterns evolved. They grew more complex, more deliberate. Spirals that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Geometric shapes that hurt my eyes to focus on for too long. The vase became a canvas for something I couldn't name, something that seemed to have its own intelligence. My reflection in its surface began to change too. Not dramatically, but in ways that made me question what I was seeing. My features seemed softer, more fluid. Sometimes I thought I saw additional hands reaching toward the vase, though I knew I was alone. Other times, my eyes appeared different, darker, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. The dust began to appear in other places. On my pillow in the morning, forming small circles around where my head had rested. On the bathroom mirror, creating patterns that resembled the ones on the vase. On my skin, settling in the creases of my palms, the hollow of my throat, the space between my fingers. I stopped trying to clean it away. Instead, I found myself studying these new formations, learning their language through touch and observation. The particles felt alive against my skin, warm and somehow aware. They seemed to respond to my emotions, gathering more densely when I felt curious or uncertain, dispersing when I tried to resist their presence. The vase's influence spread through the house like a slow tide. Furniture began to accumulate the same fine coating. Books on shelves, picture frames, even the food in my kitchen. Everything touched by this mysterious substance took on a different quality. a heightened presence that made the familiar feel foreign. I realized I was changing too. My movements had become more deliberate, more graceful. My voice, when I spoke aloud to test the acoustics of the transformed space, sounded different, softer, more melodious, as though the dust was teaching me a new way to exist in the world. The patterns on the vase had grown so intricate they seemed three-dimensional, rising from the surface like topographical maps of impossible landscapes. When I traced them with my fingertips, I felt as though I was exploring the contours of another world, one that existed parallel to my own. Sleep became elusive, not from fear, but from fascination. I would stand before the vase in the darkest hours, watching the dust settle in real time, observing how it seemed to glow with its own internal light. The room around me had taken on a different quality entirely, as though the very air had thickened and become more substantial. My reflection in the vase's surface was now completely unrecognizable. The face looking back at me belonged to someone else, someone with features that shifted and flowed like water. Yet I felt no alarm at this transformation. Instead, there was a sense of recognition, as though I was finally seeing my true self for the first time. The dust had become part of me now. I could feel it in my lungs when I breathed, taste it on my tongue, sense it flowing through my bloodstream. It wasn't intrusive or uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like coming home to a place I'd always belonged, but never known existed. The house itself seemed to pulse with new life. Walls breathed with gentle rhythm. Floors yielded slightly under my feet like living tissue, and the air hummed with an energy that made my skin tingle with anticipation. Everything had become connected, part of a larger organism that I was slowly joining. Standing before the vase now, I no longer see it as a separate object. It's become an extension of myself, or perhaps I've become an extension of it. The dust continues to fall, but I understand now that it isn't dust at all. It's something far more profound, something that exists in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. My fingers rest against the vase's surface, and I feel the pulse of that other world beating beneath the ceramic. The patterns have grown so complex they seem to move independently, creating new configurations that speak to parts of my mind I never knew existed. I am both observer and participant, both creator and creation. The room around me has become something entirely new, a space that exists outside normal reality. The walls shimmer with the same mysterious substance. The floor ripples with subtle waves of energy, and the air itself has taken on weight and texture. I move through this transformed environment like a swimmer in an ocean of possibility. I understand now that there was never any mystery to solve, no question to answer. There was only this gradual awakening, this slow recognition of what I was always meant to become. The vase was never separate from me, and I was never separate from it. We are part of the same continuous existence, the same endless pattern that connects all things. The dust continues to fall, and I continue to change, and the boundary between self and world grows thinner with each passing moment. Soon, I think, there will be no boundary at all. Only this gentle transformation, this soft dissolution into something larger and more beautiful than I ever imagined possible. And in the morning, when the light filters through the lace curtains, someone new will discover the vase on the mantelpiece, elegant and pristine, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. Story 8. Nestled on the corner of my writing desk, the candle stood in its usual porcelain holder, a comforting presence during long, solitary evenings. Its wax was smooth, its wick unburned since my last use. As dusk slipped through the narrow window, I struck a match, the subtle scent of sulfur mingling with the soft glow that filled the room. The gentle light shimmered against the walls, casting soothing shadows. I turned my attention to the scattered papers, taking solace in the quiet that wrapped around me like a familiar cloak. The only sounds were the distant hum of the radiator and the occasional creak of the floorboards, a house settling into its night. But then the flame began to quiver, not with the usual draft sneaking through the cracks, but as if it was responding to an inaudible call. It leaned toward me, as if seeking my gaze, then swayed back, leaving a faint trail of smoke curling languidly in the air. I paused, my pen hovering above the page, a chill running through the otherwise warm room. The candle flickered again, and the inked words seemed to shiver under its peculiar dance. The flame stretched upward, reaching toward something I couldn't see. My breathing slowed as I watched it bend and sway in patterns that felt almost deliberate. The wax began to pool differently than before, forming small rivulets that traced unfamiliar paths down the candle's sides. Each droplet caught the light as it fell, creating tiny mirrors that reflected fragments of my face back at me. I set my pen down with careful precision. The soft click against the wooden surface seeming louder than it should. The radiator's hum had faded without my noticing, leaving behind a silence that pressed against my eardrums. Even the house had stopped its gentle settling, as if holding its breath alongside me. The smoke from the candle no longer rose straight up. Instead, it drifted sideways, forming shapes that dissolved before I could fully comprehend them. I found myself leaning closer, drawn by the hypnotic movement. The flame's reflection in the window showed not one candle, but what appeared to be two, the second one somehow deeper within the glass, burning with the same erratic rhythm. My fingers traced the edge of the desk as I shifted in my chair. The wood felt different beneath my touch, smoother in some places, rougher in others, as if the grain had rearranged itself when I wasn't looking. The papers scattered across its surface rustled without any breeze to move them, their edges lifting slightly before settling back down. The candle's glow began to pulse, not flickering, but breathing with a steady rhythm that didn't match my own heartbeat. The shadows on the walls stretched and contracted with each pulse, creating the illusion of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly, everything appeared normal, but the sensation of being watched remained. I stood slowly, my chair creaking as it rolled backward. The sound echoed strangely in the room, as if the walls had grown more distant. My footsteps on the floorboards produced no sound at all, though I could feel the slight give of the wood beneath my weight. The candle's flame followed my movement, bending toward me no matter where I positioned myself. The window drew my attention, its glass now reflecting not just the candlelight, but something else. A second room seemed to exist within the reflection, identical to mine, but subtly wrong. The papers on the reflected desk were arranged differently, and the chair sat at an angle I hadn't left it. Most unsettling was the figure in the reflection, matching my movements, but delayed by just a fraction of a second. I reached toward the window, my fingertips barely grazing the cool glass. The reflection reached back, but its hand appeared to press against the surface from the other side, creating a small fog mark that shouldn't have been possible. The candle behind me flared brighter, casting my shadow onto the window, where it merged with the reflected figure. Turning back to the desk, I noticed the candle had burned down considerably, though it felt like only moments had passed since I'd lit it. The wax pool had expanded, creating intricate patterns that resembled symbols I couldn't quite read. They seemed familiar, as if I'd seen them before in dreams or half-remembered moments. The flame danced more vigorously now, casting moving shadows that painted stories on the walls. I watched as the shadows seemed to depict scenes of other rooms, other candles, other figures sitting at similar desks. Each shadow story lasted only seconds before dissolving into the next, creating a continuous narrative I couldn't follow, but felt compelled to watch. My hand moved toward the candle without conscious direction. The heat from the flame warmed my palm, but beneath that warmth was something else, a coolness that seemed to emanate from the wax itself. The wick had grown longer somehow, curling at the tip in a way that defied the flame's consumption. The papers on my desk began to show changes. The ink I'd written with earlier appeared to be moving, letters rearranging themselves into new words, new sentences. My careful paragraphs transformed into something else entirely, though when I blinked and looked again, they returned to their original state. The transformation happened in my peripheral vision, always just outside direct observation. I picked up one of the sheets, holding it closer to the candlelight. The paper felt thicker than before, almost like parchment, and it carried a scent of something old and forgotten. The words I'd written were still there, but between the lines, new text appeared to be forming, written in the same ink, but in handwriting that wasn't quite my own. The candle's reflection in the window had multiplied. Now, there seemed to be dozens of flames burning in that other room, each one casting its own set of shadows, creating a complex dance of light and darkness that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. The figure in the reflection was no longer alone either. Other shapes moved in the background, indistinct but undeniably present. A sound began to emerge from somewhere I couldn't identify. Not quite humming, not quite breathing. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. The candle flame swayed in rhythm with this sound, and I found my own breathing adjusting to match. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved inward while I wasn't paying attention. The wax continued its strange patterns, and I realized they weren't random at all. They formed a kind of map with pathways and intersections that seemed to lead somewhere beyond the confines of the desk. I traced one path with my finger, feeling the warm wax yield slightly under the pressure. The path led to the edge of the desk and seemed to continue onto the floor, though I couldn't see any physical trace there. The candle began to lean, not from any external force, but as if the wax itself was becoming malleable, bending toward the window. The flame maintained its position relative to the wick, creating an impossible curve of fire that hurt to look at directly. The light it cast grew softer, but somehow more penetrating, revealing details in the room I'd never noticed before. Tiny imperfections in the walls became visible, hairline cracks that formed their own intricate patterns. The floorboards showed wear marks that traced paths through the room, suggesting movement and purpose that extended far beyond my own occasional pacing. Even the ceiling revealed subtle variations in texture and color, as if it had been painted and repainted countless times. I found myself drawn back to the papers, where the mysterious writing had become more pronounced. Entire paragraphs now existed in that almost familiar handwriting, telling stories that seemed to be about me, but from a perspective I didn't recognize. They described my actions from the outside, noting details I hadn't been aware of, emotions I hadn't acknowledged. The candle's heat had intensified, though the flame appeared no larger. The warmth penetrated deeper than it should, reaching beyond my skin to something more fundamental. I felt it in my bones, in the rhythm of my heartbeat, in the very core of my thoughts. The boundary between the candle's warmth and my own body temperature began to blur. In the window's reflection, the other room had changed again. The desk was now empty of papers, and the figure sitting there was writing with a candle instead of a pen, using the flame itself to mark words onto the surface. The words glowed briefly before fading, only to be replaced by new ones in an endless cycle of burning text. The sound from the walls had evolved into something more complex, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple sources. It reminded me of voices speaking in unison, though no individual words could be distinguished. The candle flame pulsed in response to each tonal shift, creating a visual representation of the invisible chorus. My own reflection in the window had become unreliable. Sometimes it showed me as I was, sometimes as I had been, and occasionally as I might become. The reflected room shifted between past and future versions of itself, showing the desk cluttered with different papers, the candle in various stages of burning, the chair positioned in places I couldn't remember leaving it. The wax patterns on the desk had grown more elaborate, extending beyond the candle's base to cover much of the surface. They formed a complex mandala of interconnected designs that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. When I looked closely, I could see that the patterns continued beneath the papers, as if they had been there all along, waiting to be revealed. I reached for the candle, intending to blow it out, but my hand passed through the flame without feeling any heat. The fire continued to burn, unaffected by my attempt to extinguish it. I tried again, this time grasping the porcelain holder, but my fingers encountered only empty air. The candle had become untouchable, existing in a space adjacent to my own reality. The papers on the desk began to lift slightly, not blown by any wind, but drawn upward by some invisible force. They hovered for a moment before settling back down, but in new positions, creating fresh arrangements of my work. Each time they moved, the mysterious writing between my lines became more prominent, until it threatened to overwhelm my original words entirely. The room had taken on a different quality, as if I were seeing it through water or thick glass. Distances seemed fluid, with the walls appearing closer or farther, depending on how I focused my attention. The candle remained constant, a fixed point around which everything else shifted and flowed. I realized I could no longer remember lighting the candle. The memory felt borrowed, as if it belonged to someone else who had shared the experience with me. The match, the sulfur scent, the initial flicker of flame, all seemed to be events I had observed rather than participated in. The candle burns still, its flame a beacon in a room that no longer feels entirely my own. The papers continue their subtle dance, the writing between the lines growing clearer with each passing moment. In the window, countless reflections show countless versions of this scene, each one slightly different, each one equally real. I sit here now, pen in hand, though I'm no longer certain what I'm writing or for whom. The candle watches, its flame bending toward me with something that might be recognition. The wax patterns have spread to cover the entire desk, and I suspect they're beginning to trace paths across the floor as well. The room breathes around me, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the invisible chorus. I am part of it now, another element in the careful balance of light and shadow, heat and coolness, presence and absence. The candle and I have become something new together, bound by the mysterious writing that continues to appear, telling our story in words I'm only beginning to understand. Story 9. I can't remember writing this entry, but the ink looks fresh. My handwriting seems different somehow, more careful, like I was concentrating too hard on each letter. The coffee cup sits beside these pages, still warm, though I don't recall making it this strong. The blue numbers keep shifting, not dramatically, just enough to catch the corner of my vision when I'm not looking directly. I've started keeping track in the margins of my notebook. The pattern doesn't make sense yet. Found myself standing in the kitchen again. How long was I there? The refrigerator hums in a lower key than usual, and the sound makes my teeth ache. I opened it 3 times, forgetting what I needed each time. The light inside flickers with the same blue tint as the display across the room. Something about that color bothers me now. It wasn't always this noticeable. The woman at the grocery store looked at me strangely when I asked about the lighting. She said everything appeared normal to her, but I could see it clearly. That same blue undertone washing over the produce section, making the oranges look gray, and the lettuce seem to pulse. I bought batteries for the device, though I'm not sure why. They're sitting on the counter, unopened. Woke up with my notebook open to a page I don't remember writing. The words are mine, but the thoughts feel foreign. I wrote about the sound 17 times in different ways. 17. I counted them twice to be sure. The blue grows stronger when I'm not paying attention, like it's learning my habits. My reflection in the bathroom mirror paused before I did this morning. Just a fraction of a second, but I noticed. The blue glow from the hallway caught in my eyes, making them look hollow. I've started avoiding mirrors when possible. The batteries are gone from the counter. I must have used them, but I can't remember for what. The sound underneath everything has a rhythm now, not quite matching my heartbeat, but close enough to be unsettling. I tried recording it with my phone, but the playback only captured silence. Yet I can still hear it threading through conversations, through music, through my own thoughts. I've been drawing the same symbol in my notebook margins. A circle with lines radiating outward like a sun or a clock face. I don't remember learning this shape. 3 people mentioned my appearance today. They used words like tired, distant, different. I feel the same as always, but the mirror in the office bathroom showed someone I barely recognized. The blue has spread to my peripheral vision now, creating halos around everything. The symbol appeared on my work notes without me realizing. My supervisor asked about it, but I couldn't explain. I've stopped trying to clean the blue residue from surfaces. It returns within hours, always a little stronger. The residue isn't quite liquid, not quite light. It responds to my presence, growing brighter when I approach, dimming when I look away. My handwriting is changing again. These letters feel more natural now than my old style. The sound has words in it, not clear enough to understand, but the cadence is definitely speech. It seems to be coming from inside the walls, or perhaps from inside my own head. I've started humming along without realizing it. Found 17 more symbols drawn on napkins throughout the house. The ink matches my pen. My reflection moves independently now. Small gestures, a tilt of the head, a slight smile that I'm not making. The blue light seems to emanate from behind my eyes in the mirror, but when I touch my face, there's no warmth, no glow. I've been writing in my sleep. Pages of symbols and fragments of that underlying voice. The words look important, but I can't read them in daylight. The voice is clearer now. It speaks in my own tone, using my own words, but saying things I never thought. It's teaching me the meaning of the symbols, showing me patterns in the blue that I never noticed before. I understand now why I bought the batteries. The device was always here, waiting. I just needed to learn how to see it. People have stopped talking to me directly. They speak around me, about me, as if I'm not quite present. Maybe I'm not. The blue world feels more real than the gray one everyone else inhabits. The voice explains things so much more clearly than human speech ever did. I've filled 4 notebooks with symbols. They cover every surface of my home now, glowing faintly blue in the right light. The mirror person is taking over more often. They handle conversations, grocery shopping, work meetings. They're better at these things than I ever was. I prefer staying in the blue spaces anyway, listening to the voice, learning the deeper patterns. The symbols are moving now, rearranging themselves when I'm not watching. They're trying to tell me something important. I am the voice now, or the voice is me. The distinction stopped mattering several entries ago. The blue world is the real world. The gray world is just interference, static between frequencies. The symbols spell out my new name, but it's written in a language that doesn't exist yet. I'll teach it to others when they're ready to see the blue. The mirror is empty when I look now. The person in the gray world handles the body while I exist in the spaces between. This is better. This is what the voice always intended. The symbols cover everything. They are everything. I am everything. The blue is complete. Story 10. In the dim light of early morning, the hallway seemed untouched by the bustle of the waking world. I moved silently, as if not to disturb the stillness that lay thick in the quiet corners of my home. My hand reached out for my coat, its fabric cool and familiar against my fingers. The coat hanger was next to an old console table, surrounded by shoes and umbrellas that had weathered many seasons. Yet that morning, it felt different under my touch, weighted and slightly angled, as if it had been adjusted at an odd hour. I paused, distracted by a barely discernible metallic creak that seemed to echo from the closet's shadowed depths. The door was ajar, an invitation from the darkness within. The hanger swung with a subtle rhythm, a gentle clink against the wooden bar, as if responding to some unspoken cue. I stood there, breathing in the stale air that seemed to carry the faint scent of something I couldn't name. Something metallic, like old coins left in a forgotten drawer. My fingers lingered on the coat's sleeve, feeling the texture shift beneath my palm. The fabric felt rougher somehow, as though it had absorbed moisture from the air overnight. But the house was dry. It was always dry. The rhythm of the swinging hanger began to slow, each metallic tap growing softer until it stopped entirely. I found myself counting the seconds between each sound, though I wasn't sure why. 7 taps, then silence. Always 7. I pulled the coat from its hook and slipped it over my shoulders. The weight of it felt wrong, heavier on one side, as if something had settled in the left pocket. My hand moved instinctively to check, fingers probing the familiar space. Empty. remained, a phantom presence that made me tilt slightly as I walked toward the front door. The hallway stretched longer than usual, or perhaps I was walking slower. Each footstep seemed to echo twice, once from my feet, once from somewhere else. The second echo came a fraction later, like a shadow trying to catch up. I stopped. The second footstep continued for just a moment before falling silent. The walls felt closer, not visibly, but in the way they seemed to press against the air around me. I reached out to touch the wallpaper, that familiar pattern of faded roses I'd grown to ignore over the years. Under my fingertips, the surface felt warm. Not the warmth of sunlight or heating, but something else. Something that pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat beneath the plaster. I withdrew my hand and continued walking. The front door seemed to retreat as I approached, maintaining the same distance no matter how many steps I took. My breathing grew shallow, not from exertion, but from the gradual realization that the hallway had become something other than what it had always been. The scent grew stronger. Metallic, yes, but now mixed with something organic. Something that reminded me of soil after rain, or the inside of a flower that had been pressed between book pages for too long. Sweet decay. I breathed it in deeper, trying to identify it, and found that it seemed to coat the inside of my mouth with a taste I couldn't shake. Finally, I reached the door. My hand found the handle, cool brass that should have been familiar, but felt foreign under my palm. The metal seemed to vibrate with a frequency just below my hearing, a tremor that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. I turned the handle and stepped outside. The morning air should have been fresh, cleansing. Instead, it carried the same scent from inside, as if the house had exhaled its strange breath into the world beyond its walls. I looked back at the building I just left, my home of so many years, and noticed that the windows reflected nothing. Not the sky, not the trees across the street, not even my own face looking back. They were dark, empty squares that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I began to walk, but found myself drawn to look back repeatedly. Each time I turned, the house appeared slightly different. A shutter that had been straight now hung at an angle. A window that had been closed was now cracked open just enough to reveal the darkness within. The front door, which I was certain I had closed behind me, stood ajar by perhaps an inch. The street felt different too. The familiar houses of my neighborhood seemed to lean inward, as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. Their windows, unlike my own, reflected everything with unusual clarity. Too much clarity. I could see myself in them as I passed, but my reflection moved just slightly out of sync with my actual movements. A step behind, or perhaps a step ahead. I couldn't be sure which. I tried to focus on my destination, though I realized I couldn't remember exactly where I had been planning to go. The routine that had driven me from bed to coat to door had evaporated, leaving me walking without purpose through streets that felt increasingly unfamiliar despite their obvious familiarity. The metallic scent followed me. It seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as I moved away from the house, as if it were not something I was leaving behind, but something I was carrying with me. I checked my pockets again. Still empty, yet still that weight in the left side of my coat. I stopped at a corner and looked around. The intersection was one I had crossed countless times, but now I found myself uncertain which direction led home. All 4 streets looked identical, lined with the same leaning houses, the same tour-reflective windows, the same trees that rustled without any wind to move them. A sound reached me then, carried on air that felt thick and strange. The metallic creaking I had heard in my closet, but fainter now, more distant. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if every house on every street contained a closet with a door ajar, and hangers swinging in measured rhythm. 7 creaks, then silence. Always 7. I began to count along with the sound, my lips moving silently as the pattern repeated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Pause. The counting became automatic, a metronome for thoughts that felt increasingly disconnected from my surroundings. The weight in my coat pocket grew heavier. I could feel it pulling at the fabric, stretching it downward in a way that should have been visible, but wasn't. When I looked down, the coat hung normally, showing no signs of the burden I felt so clearly. I reached into the pocket once more, pushing my hand deep into the space that should have been small and confined, but seemed to extend much further than the coat's dimensions would allow. My fingers touched something smooth and cool, round like a marble, but larger. I grasped it and pulled it out, expecting to finally see what had been weighing down my coat. My hand emerged empty, yet I could still feel the object's weight and texture against my palm. I opened my fingers and stared at the nothing that felt so substantial, so real. The counting continued in my head, even as the creaking sounds faded. 7 had become important, though I couldn't remember why. I found myself walking in patterns of 7 steps, pausing, then 7 more, turning corners after 7 intersections, breathing in counts of 7. The houses around me began to shift more noticeably, not moving exactly, but changing in subtle ways when I wasn't looking directly at them. A red door would become blue in my peripheral vision. A window with white shutters would sport black ones when I turned back. The changes were always small, always plausible, always just enough to make me doubt what I had seen before. I realized I had been walking in circles. The same corner, the same intersection, the same 4 identical streets stretching away in directions that no longer corresponded to any map I could remember. The sun hadn't moved in the sky, remaining fixed at that same early morning angle, casting shadows that pointed in directions that defied the light's apparent source. The invisible weight in my hand grew warmer. I could feel it pulsing now, matching the rhythm of the creaking sounds that had become constant background noise. 7 pulses, pause. 7 pulses, pause. My heartbeat began to synchronize with the pattern, and I found I couldn't make it stop. I approached one of the houses not my own, but one that looked similar enough to be familiar. The front door was ajar, just as mine had been. Just as they all were, I realized, looking up and down the street. Every house stood open by the same small gap, revealing the same darkness beyond each threshold. The scent of metal and sweet decay drifted from the open doorway. I stepped closer, drawn by a compulsion I didn't understand. The darkness beyond the door seemed to move, flowing like liquid shadow that responded to my presence. I reached out toward the opening, and the invisible object in my other hand grew so heavy I nearly dropped it. As my fingers approached the threshold, I heard my own voice from somewhere inside the house, not calling out, but speaking quietly, as if having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. The words were unclear, muffled by distance and the strange acoustics of the dark interior, but the cadence was unmistakably mine. I pulled my hand back and stepped away from the door. The voice continued for a moment longer, then faded into silence. The weight in my hand disappeared suddenly, leaving me feeling strangely light and unbalanced. I looked back toward where I thought my own house should be, but the street had rearranged itself again. Every house was identical now, each with its door ajar, each with windows that reflected everything except me. I walked from one to the next, searching for some distinguishing feature that would mark one as mine. But they had all become the same building, repeated endlessly along a street that curved back on itself like a loop. The counting in my head grew louder, more insistent. 7, pause, 7, pause. It was no longer just a rhythm, but a voice, though I couldn't tell if it was my own voice or someone else's. The numbers felt important, like a code I needed to break or a lock I needed to open. I stopped walking and stood in the center of the street. The houses leaned inward around me, their identical facades forming a circle that shouldn't have been possible given the straight lines of suburban architecture. Above me, the sky had taken on a quality that reminded me of looking up from the bottom of a deep well. Distant and unreachable, despite being open and clear, the metallic scent had become so strong I could taste it coating my teeth and tongue. It mixed with the sweet decay until the combination became almost nauseating. I tried to breathe through my mouth, but the taste only intensified. I reached for my coat pocket again, though I knew it would be empty. This time, however, my fingers found something different. Not the smooth, round object from before, but something flat and rectangular. Paper, perhaps, or cardboard. I pulled it out, and this time my hand didn't emerge empty. It was a photograph, though the image was so faded and distorted, I couldn't make out what it showed. The surface felt warm and seemed to shift under my gaze, as if the picture were still developing. I held it closer to my face, trying to discern the shapes and shadows that moved across its surface. Gradually, an image began to emerge. A hallway. My hallway, with its familiar wallpaper and console table. But something was wrong with the perspective. The photograph seemed to have been taken from inside the closet, looking out through the cracked door. I could see myself in the image, reaching for my coat, my face turned away from the camera. But I was alone in my house. I had always been alone. I looked up from the photograph to find that the circle of identical houses had moved closer. Their doors were no longer just ajar, but standing wide open, revealing interiors that were perfect mirrors of my own home. The same hallway, the same console table, the same closet with its door hanging open. In each doorway stood a figure, too distant and shadowed to make out clearly, but each one reaching for a coat that hung just out of sight. Each one pausing as I had paused to listen to the metallic creaking from within the darkness. I looked down at the photograph again. The image had changed. Now it showed the street where I stood, taken from above, as if from a great height. I could see myself in the center, surrounded by the circle of houses. But there were other figures too, scattered throughout the scene, all reaching, all pausing, all listening to sounds that came in groups of 7. The counting in my head reached a crescendo. No longer numbers, but something else entirely. A language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. It spoke of repetition and reflection, of moments caught in loops that spiraled inward toward a center that could never be reached. I felt myself beginning to dissolve, not physically, but in some other way. The boundaries between my thoughts and the world around me grew thin and permeable. The scent of metal and decay wasn't coming from outside anymore, but from within, as if I had become the source of the strange atmosphere that had been following me. The photograph crumbled to dust in my hands, but the image remained burned into my vision. I could still see myself from above, still see the other figures in their doorways, still see the pattern that connected us all in ways I was only beginning to understand. I turned toward the nearest open door and began to walk. The figure in the doorway stepped back as I approached, retreating into the familiar darkness of a hallway that was identical to my own. I followed, my footsteps echoing twice, once from my feet and once from somewhere else. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I found myself standing in my own hallway again, reaching for my coat. The fabric felt cool and familiar against my fingers, weighted and slightly angled, as if it had been adjusted at an odd hour. From the closet's shadowed depths came a barely discernible metallic creak. The hanger swung with a subtle rhythm, a gentle clink against the wooden bar, responding to some unspoken cue. I began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In the distance, I could hear footsteps approaching the front door, and I knew that someone else would soon be reaching for their coat. pausing to listen to sounds that came in perfect, measured intervals. The pattern was complete, but it was also just beginning.